On this channel, I like to talk about relevant games. So this is kind of unusual in which I really have to talk about Overwatch for a bit because this is, I think, a textbook example as to what's going to happen to every major new IP that comes out going forward. Okay, traditionally, what would happen is that the third party would produce a game that appeal to Western markets. It would be worshipped by game journals. It'd be hyped up, and then it would sell to a couple of million units. Be mogged by Nintendo, never be brought up again, and then would slowly kind of fade into irrelevancy. Okay, we've seen this pattern play out with games like Final Fantasy VII and Metal Gear Solid. Grand Theft Auto, Minecraft, we've seen this happen time and time again, where some random thing is hyped up as being better than Nintendo, way better than Nintendo, and then eventually it just kind of reaches its natural high point and falls off really sharply after that. While the Nintendo keeps getting more and more relevant and more popular. I don't think anything encapsulates this mindset more than Overwatch, because Overwatch is a very interesting game because its marketing campaign was the most asinine I've ever seen. Right. When you look at what Overwatch did with the marketing campaign, it did this thing where it was oh yeah, we're an online shooter, but we're colorful. Oh, nobody else does that, right? And then if you're a Nintendo fan, you kind of sit there and you're just Splatoon's been out for a year already. Splatoon is way better than this, right? But at the time, people were salivating over Nintendo hate. They propped up Overwatch, they worshipped it, they said it was the greatest thing ever. Oh, Maze Bay, you had people simping for the characters. Blizzard was sanctioning officially made porn with the renders, right? It was disgusting. Okay, there was this huge hype cycle around Overwatch. There was this huge feeling that this was go on to be this huge cultural phenomenon and this huge deal, and then the game came out and absolutely crickets. Okay, what you have to understand about Overwatch is that there are people who put thousands of hours into this game. There are people who obsess over it. There are people who think it's their favorite thing ever. But what typically happens is that these guys only play Overwatch, and eventually they get tired of it and kind of fade away, and then they never come back, and more people don't come in. Okay, Blizzard is very, very interesting because they've tried all sorts of publicity stunts to keep Overwatch relevant. Back in the day, they would just announce that a character was gay, or that they would formally announce a new character, or they would announce Overwatch 2, which was basically just an update to the first game. We saw this play out time and time again of them desperately trying to stay relevant, desperately trying to compete. And slowly we've seen them kind of backtrack on certain things. There was a period of time where initially they had all this sexy marketing. They would have all these sexy outfits, and then they tried rolling them back so the characters would be taken more seriously. But joke's on them, because people only cared about the sexy outfits. That's the only reason anybody was paying for cosmetics. So they had to bring it back to try and stay relevant. Didn't work. They tried having all these animations going over the character backstories. Didn't work. You had this big push to try and make Overwatch the beloved multiplayer online shooter of the decade, right? This huge deal, and it got mogged by Splatoon, because Splatoon did something that I think Overwatch just wasn't able to do. And it was able to actually have sequels. It was able to actually grow. It was able to actually innovate. It was able to constantly bring new people in while keeping older fans happy, at least for the sequels. Splatoon had a way more viable business model than Overwatch. And that's the interesting things about this, because the narrative was always that Overwatch was way bigger than Splatoon, that Overwatch was going to destroy Splatoon, that Nintendo could never possibly compete with Blizzard. But Blizzard is a company that's been on its last legs for a decade, actually, since Diablo 3 came out, in my opinion. And, Nintendo keeps getting bigger and bigger every year. Splatoon Raiders is coming out this year, and that's the way it looks now. That's going to be a very successful early Switch 2 game. Blizzard pushes this narrative that they're the best in the industry, that you need to buy their games day one. And they tend to have this big push day one. but or like traditionally they did. But what ends up happening is that they end up gassing out and becoming completely irrelevant. Splatoon was able to beat Overwatch by simply having consistent, high quality releases while slowly building up its Western fan base. While Overwatch tried chasing clout by making everyone gay, pulling all these stunts, and eventually just lost its core player base. It's remarkable how badly Splatoon has raped Overwatch over the past decade, even though uh, that nobody has been paying attention or cares, right? Like that's the reality of the situation. Is that the narrative was that of course Overwatch was bigger and more successful, and now we're seeing situations where Overwatch 2 is getting rolled back into Overwatch 1 because the publicity stunt to make Overwatch relevant again by turning it into its own sequel did not pan out very well. That's just the short of it. Meanwhile, Splatoon is actually producing sequels, actually producing spin-offs. They actually understand what the player base actually wants. Blizzard, they aren't capable of doing that. And that becomes more and more apparent every year. Who do you know who gives a fuck about Diablo 4? Who the fuck thinks about WoW in this day and age? The reality is Nintendo is raping this company right now, and there's just no coping and seething about it, and nobody really wants to admit it. Because that would be acknowledging that the genre that was instrumental to the success of the gaming PC back in the 90s is now exclusively in the hands of the kings of the industry, Nintendo, the consoles, the winner of the console war, Blizzard just cannot compete with Nintendo in this space. And that's going to become more and more apparent over the next couple of decades, Overwatch is already irrelevant. Imagine what it's going to look like 10 years from now. Imagine, it's probably not even going to be active, 10 years from now. And yet, this is supposed to be, some huge major IP. It just isn't, none of the characters are iconic. Nobody knows who the fuck they are, they were always just worshipped just because they're an Overwatch. I've heard anecdotes, about people seeing Overwatch characters in game and being I mostly know this character from porn. Okay. People don't even know about Overwatch as a game. They mostly know it from all this SFM porn that gets produced and distributed through 4chan or however it's distributed. Again, I'm not an expert on SFM porn, obviously, but that's the reason this game took off in a weird way, is that they lean so hard on the Rule 34 stuff, and they lean so hard on gamers worshiping them that just because they were Blizzard. Now that they're a more controversial company, and now that people understand that they've completely fallen off, that they really have nothing going for them. I don't think it's a coincidence that one of the most vocal anti-woke advocates in the industry, Grums, is a former indie a Blizzard dev. Because he's able to give insights as to what the culture is there and how badly it's fallen off. And it's something that really should be talked about more in this sense, is that Blizzard simply isn't capable of putting out a good game. And anybody who spent enough time watching them or playing their games should be able to tell you that.